Hey there, it's Daphne from Blue Quarry, and today I'm going to share with you a simple little trick I use to make kefir at home that has the consistency of store-bought yogurt. If you're new to kefir, or as some people like to call it, kefir, it's a wonderful yogurt-like food full of gut-healthy probiotics and super low in lactose. The basic process you see me doing here is simple. I start with some kefir grains in a small glass jar, pour cold milk right from the refrigerator over the grains, secure a coffee filter over the top with a rubber band, then place it in a pantry or cabinet out of direct sunlight and allow it to ferment overnight. If you like sipping your yogurt in a smoothie form, you won't mind kefir's thinner consistency. But if, like me, you prefer eating your yogurt with a spoon, listen on. If I want my kefir to have a much thicker consistency, like Greek yogurt or cream cheese, it requires an additional step and an extra day or two where I strain it through a paper filter. However, I figured out a way to make kefir that has a consistency very close to regular store-bought yogurt or sour cream with just a little tweak to the process I was already using to separate out my grains without having to go through an extra step or the extra time. Now what you see here are those same jars of kefir about 12 hours later. That's halfway through the fermentation process. This is an important step. Grab your jars from the pantry and give them a good stir. You want to loosen up the kefir grains that have floated to the top and help the kefir to continue to ferment and separate into curds and whey. Once that's done, put your covers back on and pop it back into the pantry for the rest of the 24-hour cycle. So here are those same two jars I just pulled out of my pantry 12 hours later, and you can see how nice and cleanly it's separated into curds and whey. So while the next step is typically to just separate your kefir grains from your kefir, I find it's the perfect opportunity to get rid of the excess whey at the same time. Now you probably noticed that this batch didn't separate as cleanly as the last one that I showed, but the process is still the same. What I do is I take a rubber spatula and I carefully slide it down the side of the jar to release that whey, to allow that whey to sort of float out freely. And then I pour that whey very gently through a strainer into a glass measuring cup, a very large measuring cup. Now the idea here is to pour off as much of that whey without disturbing the curds as possible. And even if some of the curds fall into the strainer like they do here, it's still going to stop them from getting into that lower portion until you start to agitate it. As you can see, I normally just dump my whey down the drain, but you can also hold on to it and use it for a multitude of uses, including smoothies and soaking beans. So by all means, if you want to hold on to it, go ahead and pour that into another storage container and put it in your fridge for later use. So once I've gotten rid of the whey in my big measuring cup, I can go ahead and empty the contents of my containers into that strainer and begin to strain out the kefir grains. One thing that's important to note, the longer your fermentation, the more separation you'll have and the thicker your kefir will be. However, you'll also have a kefir that's a little bit more tart and more fizzy, so you have to come up with a combination that works best for you. So here you see me just stirring my kefir and allowing the kefir to drop down into the container below, and the kefir grains will remain in the strainer above. Another way to do this would be simply to lift the strainer up and sort of bang it down on the rim of the container. This works only if your strainer and your container are about the same size, but that also works well too. So in case you're wondering, kefir grains aren't actually grains. They are grain-like colonies of yeast and lactic acid bacteria that are used obviously to convert your milk into kefir. What I'm doing here is I'm scraping off my spatula. I want to make sure that I don't have any loose kefir grains on there before I do this step, which is just getting all the kefir off the bottom of that strainer into my container. Now, if you do get some kefir grains in your finished kefir, fear not. We are going to, or I at least, like to blend it up with an immersion blender before I eat it. And so any grains that do end up in your kefir will get blended away and you won't even know that they're there. I like to keep them separate though. That's just a personal preference. I know people who don't get too concerned with the kefir grains and blend them up and love it that way. So here you see me measuring out my kefir grains. The reason I'm doing that is because I found that the kefir grains tend to multiply. So if you want to have consistent results, you do need to make sure that you're putting the same ratio of kefir grains to milk and fermenting at the same amount of time each time. So once you find that magic combination that works for you, that produces the results that you like, you want to stick with it. The recipe that I use begins with about 1/4 cup of kefir grains and 2.5 cups of milk, and I allow it to ferment, as I mentioned, for 24 hours. But you can start with that recipe and then tweak it to get the results that work for you. Here I am just sort of getting all my kefir into my little container. I seal it up with a plastic lid, and then that goes in the fridge. Now the kefir grains that I scooped out are in 2 clean mason jars. I think these are quart-sized mason jars, and I'm putting in milk until it hits about the 2.5 cup line there. And then I put a coffee filter on top with a rubber band, and that will go into my pantry until it's time to give it a good stir, and you basically start all over. So if you're looking for more detailed information on the supplies I use or on living foods in general, please check out my website, bluequarry.com. Thanks for watching.